enemy of apathy, purveyor of poignancy, teacher, scholar, artist, jack of all trades, Renaissance man, Dr. Punya Mishra, please.
Okay. I have this quote from John Cleese, partly because I like John Cleese, but partly because it sort of connects with what I'm going to talk about. This idea of creativity as not being a talent, but as a way of operating. And I will speak a little bit more about that as we go on. So anyway, it's wonderful to be here. I've been here all day today. I had some wonderful sessions with students, with faculty members. There's some great conversations around what it means to teach, what it means to be an educator, what it means to use these new tools and devices that we have all around us, and how we can be thoughtful and judicious in how we use them. And tell you a little bit more about myself, as Mark has left anything else to say. But anyway, since I have it in my slides, I have to go through it, right? So my dream, and I've shared it with some of you before, it's to be on The Simpsons. And that's what I would look like if I were on The Simpsons. It's pretty good, right? There's a website you can actually go make your own Simpsons character, so that's kind of cool. I am at Michigan State University. Go Spartans! Just had a big football game where we beat our rivals U of M nicely, which was good. And my son goes to U of M, which was doubly good, so that we beat him. I also direct our Master of Arts in Educational Technology program, which is a program which we spent actually quite a bit of time talking about this afternoon. I'm interested in a whole bunch of different things, issues around education and learning and teaching, but, I have a background which goes to, I have an undergraduate in engineering, left that and went into visual communications and design with an idea of making educational film, got interested in technology, started working with the Mac. So at that time, I sort of started seeing some of the possibilities there. And I'm talking of when computers were made of straw, so this is way before many of you guys, your time, all right? So, but it was, and sort of, interested in aesthetics, psychology, engineering, all of those things and how they play out together. Most of my sort of work has actually focused, specifically in my research, has focused at this intersection of technology and education. What does it mean to use these tools in teaching, in learning? So as an academic, this is the sort of stuff I do. I study how people use these tools and technologies, and I write journal articles about them, which end up being read by like 6 people. So at some level, I am a researcher. But as I was thinking about coming and talking to you guys today, and Mark had told me that he isn't sure what the audience would be like. He's made this open to the community, and I had no idea who would be here. So I said, let me today not speak as a researcher, and speak rather as somebody who's a parent. As somebody who has 2 children, I have one who's a freshman in the college, and one who's a sophomore in high school, a son who's in college, a daughter sophomore in high school. And thinking about what does it mean? What is this journey that has brought me to this point of thinking about their education, their life, their future? And through that, for us to reflect on what does it mean to be in this world today that we live in, right? And the future that we don't know. So quickly, a little bit of sense of my journey getting here. This is where I was born, the eastern coast of India. Went to school in the Northeast for a couple of schools there. Ended up in New Delhi, where I got my high school, my undergraduate degree in engineering. And this was the turning point of my life, which is that I joined this center called the Industrial Design Center, where for the first time, all these different things that I've been interested in, like literature and art and science and math and technology and all of that sort of came together in this degree in design. And that's when I realized that I need to understand more about how we as humans learn. And so I took a flight and ended up at the University of Illinois, where I got my PhD, ended up at Michigan State University. And these are the 2 kids who sort of, the 2 people, they don't look like this anymore. They're all pimples and all that kind of stuff. No, not really. They're pretty good-looking, handsome kids like you. But, at some level, watching them as they've gone through school and thinking about that has sort of given a sort of a layer of, complexity to my thinking about education, because it's no longer this abstract thing that I'm a researcher and I'm thinking about what kind of cognitive structures do people have in their heads when they understand a scientific concept. It is about their coming home and my asking them, so what happened today? Nothing. It's like, that's not even possible. How can nothing have happened today? you know. So anyway, so they joke about me and my wife, and that's an acronym I don't know if you've heard of. This is like Indian kids who's, so we call them this. We call these kids who are like first generation American but originally from India. They're called American-born confused Desis. So A, B, C, D, that's what we call them. And my kids hate that. It's like, no, stop it, And Desi is basically a slang word that Indians call each other. You can do it, we can do it, something like that, right? So my son turns it on me and he says, actually, Papa, it's the other way. It should be DCBA because your Desi is confused by America, right? And so for the longest time, this was an interesting point. I'd been at Michigan State for a bunch of years. My kids were growing up here. We were sort of embedded in the community and so on. But I sort of held on to my Indian citizenship. And it was partly, that this is who I am. Am I giving up a part of my identity by doing so? But here's the interesting thing that happened. I was being invited to come and talk to audiences like this all over the country. And then when I would talk, I would always say, this is what we need to do for our kids. This is what we need to do in our schools. And I realized that some kind of a mental bridge had been crossed, when I was in India, I would talk to my wife and I say, I'm homesick, I want to come home. Which is kind of weird because when I was in the US, I was saying, I haven't been home in a while, and I meant India, right? So, it was this interesting mix. But it was, I think, more than anything else, this realization that since my kids are growing up in this country, since I am spending time working with teachers and educators in this country, that there is a stake here that I put into making this the best that it can be. And so we went ahead and got our citizenship. That's what my kids look like now, at least a year or so ago. Pretty good looking, right? And thinking about, as they graduate in their lives, is preparing for a future that I can't predict. There's this element that you want to protect your kids from all of this, right? So from change, and you want to prepare them for the best, and you know that you can't. And so that sort of brought me to thinking about what is this thing that everybody talks about these days, this thing called 21st century learning. You hear that everywhere. Are we preparing your kids for the 21st century? We should have been asking that question in 1980 and not in 2014, because then at least we could be preparing for the 21st century. Now we're in the middle of it. And I've, in fact, worked on a panel which wrote a report, and I was still struggling with this idea. What is this thing called the 21st century learning? What does that mean? And so, like any respecting academic, I went and did a Google search. Got 23 million hits in 0.23 seconds. So one of the things that comes up is very often is this, that 21st century kid means somebody, talking about 21st century, the new generation, the millennial generation, the digital generation, that it's all about these devices and their brains are wired differently and so on and so forth. When I look at when people talk about 21st century learning and teachers, it would be things like this. Current tools like blogs or wikis or apps. And I said, this is easy. I figured out what 21st century learning is. So what's the key takeaway? Now think about it. A century is 100 years. But the takeaway that I got from reading this stuff was that 21st century learning will depend on early 21st century technology. Which means what's cool today is going to be for the next 100 years. It's what's going to determine learning in the 21st century. So I said, okay, what would that experiment look like if I went back 100 years? What if I looked at the technologies that were around in 1914 and see how they influenced learning and education in that rest of the century? So again, going back to trusty Google, right? So some cool things came up. We have crayons, vacuum dot, color photo. Now, crayons are a wonderful educational technology. We still use them. Anybody from 3 years old to 93-year-old can use crayons, right? But to say that crayons would be the future of all 20th century learning, that's a really stupid idea. If you think about 1903, the Wright brothers got on a plane for 40 seconds or 43 seconds or something that way. By 1950s, grandmothers were being tucked in as they flew across the Atlantic. So to think that the tools and technologies that we have in 2014 are going to determine all of what 21st century learning is clearly missing the boat. And clearly what 21st century learning has to go beyond the newest and shiniest thing. And so that set us on this task with one graduate student. We said, what if we did sort of a synthesis of what different people are talking about. So I'm talking about a little research project that we did. So clearly we couldn't include all 23 million Google hits analysis. So what we did is we went with some really key frameworks and books that are out there. So you'll recognize Young Zhao, who's over here in Oregon, who used to be at Michigan State, Daniel Pink, Howard Gardner, Partnership for 21st Century Skills, OECD. All of these people have put forward their vision of what they think 21st century learning is. And so we ended up with a total of 15 different frameworks. And we did a very high-tech analysis, with using some really high-tech tools that we have at Michigan State. Namely, we cut them up in a little piece of paper, and two of us sat and moved pieces of paper around till we found some coherent sort of structures emerge, which is sort of the classic way of doing qualitative research when you think about it. All the other stuff, pull down menus and this, that, these are all fancy stuff for really moving pieces of paper around. And three big ideas emerged from that. And I want to share sort of these three big ideas, what they are. So 21st century learning. The first big idea that emerges from that is what we call foundational knowledge. Okay? Foundational knowledge has three different components to it. It's core content knowledge, so knowledge of physics, knowledge of math, of music, of art, core foundational content, subject matter areas that we teach in schools is still going to be important. And that is obvious. If you're going to be a chip designer, you have to know physics, you have to know your math. That's not going to happen without that. The next big thing, of course, is digital ICT literacy, which is knowledge of how to use these tools. That's foundational. If you don't know how to do that, you can't. And the third piece was cross-disciplinary knowledge. And I'll come to that a little bit more in the later part of my talk. But if you want to be a good video game designer, not a profession that existed when I was growing up, which is kind of an interesting thing. But if you want to be a good video game designer, you can't just be a programmer. You have to be a programmer. You have to know architecture, design, visual design. Most probably, you need to know some theater and drama. Because the people who can best create an immersive environment are people who are in improv theater. With nothing, they can make you feel like you are in this world. And so if you want to be a good video game designer, it's not enough for you to know the computer side of things. You have to know the psychology of the individual. You have to know how to create these worlds which are immersive. That's a very different kind of set of mix of tools. So the three pieces that come up are in the foundational knowledge, are core content knowledge, cross-disciplinary knowledge, and digital and ICT literacy. The second piece that comes up in our structure, and again, I want to be clear, this is not stuff that we came up with. This is not Punya Mishra's view of 21st century learning. This is an abstraction from 15 of these frameworks. Okay, this is what the frameworks are saying. We just put it together. So what we call meta-knowledge, and these you will usually see when people talk of 21st century learning. They'll often talk about creativity and collaboration, creativity, innovation, problem solving, critical thinking, communication, and collaboration. You'll often hear these terms thrown about, right? But I think it's really important to see that this meta-knowledge is a way of acting on that foundational knowledge, which means creativity cannot exist in a vacuum. You cannot collaborate about nothing. So if you have to collaborate, if you have to be innovative, you have to be creative, it has to be on certain foundational knowledge that you have around which you can do that. The third piece that emerged is what we call humanistic knowledge. And I was actually kind of surprised to see this because I wasn't really expecting that. I was in fact expecting most of it to be this, some that, and I wasn't really expecting this. And that was actually a very pleasant surprise. Because these are sort of the values that we bring to the educational process. So this helps us determine what is foundational, helps us determine how we act on that knowledge. And so there are again components to that, which is life and job skills, how to work with people, how to look ahead, plan, organize, so on, ethical and emotional awareness. In a world where we are consistently being distracted by things, to be able to have self-regulation. for a child to be able to say that, yeah, I need to finish my homework, and after I finish my homework is when I will check my text messages or whatever it may be. That's self-regulation, that's focus. Those are skills that need to be developed. We live in an increasingly global world. A month ago I was in Chile. Now I'm here. I work with people who are spread out all over the world. Knowing how to interact and engage with people becomes really important. Understanding cultural differences becomes really important. So these are sort of the three things. So the three key pieces that emerge, what we call the knowledge that you know, knowledge, how you can act on that knowledge, and the values that we bring to that process. So this was the framework, and we published this. I think it was published last year. Recently won an award for best paper, which is kind of cool. So the question then becomes is, what does this mean?